Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you from Film Fanatic headquarters on a nice, balmy Saturday morning at 10:20. It's a nice, balmy minus 13 degrees. Um, yeah, pretty awesome. Hope everyone's doing good. It got really cold last night, to say the least. It got down to minus 15. But I looked at the temperatures today, and it's actually going to be getting a little bit warmer during the day, which is like minus 2, minus 3 degrees, maybe 5, but not as cold. And then tonight, like late tonight, it's going to get back down to minus 15. Pretty surreal, pretty crazy. Full on Arctic blast. The other day, or yesterday, I had a gig that was scheduled at the Camden Snowball last night, but it got canceled because the Snowball, which is like the local kind of ski, hotspot for skiers, they were closed. And this weekend was the start of the national toboggan races, which is huge deal for this area. I mean, there's like thousands and thousands of people that usually come into town for that. So, and they have all kinds of events, and they have music, throughout the weekend. It usually kicks off on Thursday and just goes till Sunday. But the Snowball, as far as I know, it's the first time in history actually closed this weekend. Uh, they weren't open yesterday, and they're not open today. And they're going to do everything, try to cram in all the events, I think, on Sunday, which is crazy. So they had a bunch of music and stuff and things, planned, and all kinds of events. So they moved everything to Sunday, and due to scheduling conflicts, a lot of groups, a lot of bands can't do it. One of the bands I was going to play with, we were able to do it tomorrow, so we got a slot for Sunday during the day, and it's supposed to be, I think, in the 30s and 40s, like more, normal weather. Still cold, but normal. So yeah, pretty strange. And then it's gonna go back up to the 40s, I guess, after that. And so yeah, just a weird Arctic blast. But it was funny. Yesterday, I ended up going into work because I had called the day. I had gotten the day off because of the gig, but then the gig got canceled because of the cold, and I went into work, and and then after work I just kind of hibernated. I was gonna go see some friends play, but it was too damn cold, so I just stayed home. And then tonight there's a band I really want to see, my friend Andre's band, very greasy. They're a really awesome band, and it's gonna be a little bit warmer. Not saying much, but I'm getting a little bit of cabin fever from being home the last well, day and a half stuck in my house. So I think I'm going to venture out and see that, and see how that goes. That should be fun. But I was saying when I was at work yesterday, I was thinking, well, I think I was telling my coworker that I was thinking of going out to go see music, and then I had a gig canceled. That's why I went to work and all that kind of stuff. And then I said, well, I think I'm probably going to just, because at that point the temperature was getting colder and colder. It was dropping more and more. It was like minus 5, minus 10 at that point, and it was during the day in the mid to late afternoon, and it was just getting colder. So I was like, nope, I'm gonna probably just stay home, and I did. And I was like, I think I'm gonna just sit home and watch The Thing. Maybe watch both versions of John Carpenter's The Thing to continue with the Arctic, theme. Um, but yeah, pretty crazy. So, but again, I want to thank everyone for checking out this channel. It's been growing more and more. I got, been getting more and more subscribers every day. I said before too in other, I've said talked about it before in previous videos. When I first started hitting up the YouTube channel, I've had this YouTube channel for Film Fanatic actually for a few years. And originally I had, it was going to be set up just for quantum stuff. Like when I kind of launched way back when, well, when we started the band quite a few years ago, and then a couple of years after that, or just about that time, I started to try to, build a little bit of, an online presence. And I have this tiny little record label called Berenice Records, and it's been really cool because it's basically just a self-contained record label, and we release all of our quantum albums through it. And I've worked on a couple of other projects with it to with other groups, other projects, other bands. We have I think we have about 6 to 7 albums. We have about 5 quantum albums, and then I have an album that I had done early on, which was initially the first release, which was like a solo kind of rock instrumental project that I did, and it was a one-off project, and it was the first time that I had done anything like that, but it was also like the launch for Berenice Records. So, and when we started, we got a website built. We got I started to try to get a little bit more of an online presence, and with I built a Facebook page, and and then also started using Bandcamp, or actually SoundCloud, Reverb Nation, and then a Twitter account. And then a couple of years after that, I had set up a YouTube channel. And YouTube, I didn't really know anything about, so I just kind of had it, and I was gonna like eventually use it for Berenice Records and Quantum. Basically, I would use it for promotional use and what have you. So over the years, and also around that time, I started the Film Fanatic Facebook page. And for quite a few years, I've had the Film Fanatic Facebook page for about 4 or 5 years. It was a few years after I started the whole quantum thing, and tried to build it up. And then I started the Facebook Film Fanatic page, and then that for a long time was just kind of sitting there as a little bit of a presence, where I just started doing little reviews and posts, and it was a slow kind of climb. And then during the pandemic, I started to hit it up really hard. I started using it a lot because there was a lot of downtime, obviously. So I started concentrating a little bit more and watching tons of movies. I started watching more and more movies, so I started posting on that. And I noticed, there were a couple of things that I did where I got, there's a movie that came out, a documentary called Into the Devil's Den, which was about Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. And it was a documentary, and I had done a big post about that movie, that documentary that I really liked. And I had gotten, and the director had contacted me about the post, and that he liked the post. And then I noticed that was right around during the pandemic when it was at its full bore. And I started doing some other posts around some other movies, and I noticed suddenly I was getting a big response from the public, and a lot of people were liking the page, and it had this really slow trickle to a little bit of an explosion with activity. So it was cool, and then after that, I tried to capitalize on that, and I tried to do a little bit more of a higher profile way of, or higher profile assortment of posts about movies, and I did a lot more, and I started posting quite a few. And then fast forward you know about a year or so of that, I noticed the Facebook page was growing more and more. So I that was when I had the idea of, maybe I'll expand it and do the Facebook Live thing. And then about a year ago, over a year ago, I started doing these Facebook Live videos, And then I did a couple of little interviews. And then I noticed with that, that started to really build things up quite a bit. And it was reaching more and more of an audience. And I was getting some pretty good feedback around it. And then last year, I started a Instagram page. And I started using that also for Film Fanatic. And I noticed that that started to really build up quite a bit. And suddenly I had these two pages that I was working on, just uploading more and more reviews and content. You know, really everything and anything that I found of interest about movies. And then also I was concentrating on doing these little reviews. And and then just really recently, this past summer, you know, I wanted to keep trying to think on how to expand the page more. And I started at that point. I was almost a year into doing these Facebook Live videos, and it was going really well. And I was getting a lot of attention. It was getting a lot more hits, and people were chiming in, and it was definitely building an audience, and it was really a lot of fun. It was a very new thing for me. I've never really been comfortable speaking in public, so for me, it was like a thing of coming out of my shell a little bit and trying to figure out how to articulate certain things a little bit better. But I noticed, and I started to really enjoy it, and I was learning a lot. But after about a year or so, I realized that that I was starting to have some tech problems with my connection here at my house, and I started not being really happy with the quality of the video and the audio. I was using At first, I was using my laptop for the Facebook Live videos, and then I was having some problems with my connection at that point, because that's a thing that happens here in this part of the state for some reason. I don't understand why, but the connection gets pretty slow. And then for the remainder of me doing those videos, I started switching over to other devices, and I started mainly using my phone. And I was having a little bit more success with that. But I overall wasn't really happy with the quality of the sound and the picture and all these things. But I noticed it was still garnering up, interest, and I was very much enjoying the videos that I was doing and learning a lot. And then I realized, wait, I have this YouTube channel, but I never use it. Why don't I try that? And YouTube was always very intimidating to me, because I always heard that it was a lot harder to kind of build up an audience, and you're kind of in this big black void of a space. And I found that, like, working with Facebook and Instagram, whoever likes your page or whoever is kind of your friend, they get the notifications, and it just felt like you're automatically, when you go live, you have maybe 100 people that are already there, and so you do have an audience. But the problem with the Facebook Live thing was if there are glitches, if there are mistakes, things go awry, or you basically fuck up in your delivery, you can't really change it. So you have to, like, go with it. And that was one thing I didn't like about it, was that you didn't have any control over the content that way. So I decided to, experiment with the YouTube thing, and then I started doing the videos, and then I was doing them, once or twice a week. Didn't know, not that I know what I'm doing now, but I noticed that, okay, this is fun, and I started doing it, slowly. And when I was doing the Facebook Live videos, I was doing them only, once a month. I would try to break it up. And then when I started to get into the YouTube thing and started learning a little bit more, I just started cranking them out more, where I was doing them a couple times a week. And then things get changed quite a bit with my schedule, and I kind of changed how I was doing it, and it got a lot easier for me to do the videos. And now I do the videos every day. And I noticed, since I've been doing them every day, it's definitely helped with, the interest, even though it's small potatoes, but I noticed it's really helped with the page overall, the overall kind of thing of Film Fanatic growing quite a bit, and then also specifically to the YouTube channel. and I like the quality a lot better for the audio and the video, and the idea that you can edit stuff and you have a little bit more creative control over the content that you put out. So I decided to switch gears entirely and just focus on the YouTube channel. So that's been a lot of fun, and now that's what I do. I don't really have any interest in doing any like Facebook Live videos because of the quality aspects. But I noticed since I've been doing it, like it's been helping. Every day I've been getting more and more hits, and I've been venturing into doing specialty videos where I'll focus on one or two particular things. Maybe I'll do a show, say on a favorite director or whatnot, or maybe I'll pick a topic, pick a random topic that I think about that's definitely related to films and movies, but are very much separate. And then I've mixed in doing videos on my band Quantum, where that to me is an extension of all this and very much a part of it. So I'll do like specialty videos on those kinds of things. And I've acquired over the past year or so from our gigs as Quantum, we've gotten some pretty decent videos. So I've been uploading those kinds of things, and so there's more things like that coming up. Pretty soon in the future, we did a show. We had a Quantum show last weekend, and my friend John Luft, who is a really good friend and really good tech guy, we had talked about it over this past year about him coming and filming one of our shows. He came to our album release party and recorded us and got some good footage, and so I uploaded that. He came to one of our shows, our show last week, the last show we just did, and it was unplanned. It wasn't. I didn't think he was. I didn't know he was going to be there, and he showed up with a couple of cameras and he recorded the entire show. So I'm getting a hold of all of that stuff, and I think there's going to be some good stuff in there, and that's going to be another like release that I'm going to put up on here. And I've really expanded, trying to do more and more interviews. I really love that. That's like my favorite thing. So it's been a lot of fun. Still learning, still working out all the kinks, and it's all like I look at everything that I do, whether it's music or movie stuff or whatever. Everything is a work in progress. So it's all another cog in the wheel, if you will. So today's show is about a movie I bought last year called Master of the World. This movie is kind of an acid trip. It came out right around the same year that a Hollywood movie that was called Quest for Fire. It came out, I believe, right around the same period. And Quest for Fire is basically, and also, this Master of the World came out in 1983, and it's an Italian film. Quest for Fire was an American movie that came out in 1982, and it was up for a bunch of awards. It was a real big box office hit. 20th Century Studios had put it out, and it's basically about the whole scenario of that movie. It's basically a silent film. I've always loved Quest for Fire, and it's a pretty big budget movie. It was kind of considered an epic film, but it's basically about the rise of man and the Cro-Magnon tribes that during the prehistoric timeline, on how about the dawn of man and the various tribes that sprung out of that, and just their basic survival, on how they survived in their environment. It's a very barbaric movie. It's pretty brutal. It's pretty harsh, and it's essentially about these cavemen that are trying to survive in this like really dangerous environment. And it was a pretty big box office hit. And it was a movie I used to always see. I saw a bunch of times as a kid. I always loved it. I was always fascinated by, that period in history, the prehistoric time, and it really shows that it really puts you in that place of what it's like, what it probably was like to be a living completely in this primal state trying to survive. And Master of the World came out a couple of years after that. And it's basically like I kind of feel like Master of the World is kind of like the exploitation version of Quest for Fire. And it's basically the same movie, but it's an Italian movie. It has a lot less. The budget is way smaller. It was directed by Alberto Cavallone. It came out in 1983. It's an Italian movie. It's pretty obscure. It had a little bit. I know with the history of this film, it had a pretty decent amount of success when it first came out. And it's basically the whole scenario is pretty much identical to Quest for Fire in a lot of ways. The shocking, brutal tale of primitive humans, including a great warrior who had to either adapt to the savage environment or disappear into oblivion. And again, this is like the Italian exploitation version of Quest for Fire, which was like an American movie. And this movie has a lot less of a budget than Quest for Fire had. It's essentially a uh, a silent movie, just like Quest for Fire. The interesting thing is, like, I've just started watching this movie again, and this came out on Vinegar Syndrome. Vinegar Syndrome is a company I've talked a lot about in previous shows. You have Vinegar Syndrome, you have Blue Underground, you have Synapse, you have Mondo Macabra, um, Severin. I know there's probably about 4 or 5 other kind of quote unquote boutique labels that put out exploitation movies. The biggest ones are, Vinegar Syndrome is pretty huge. Synapse is a very popular one. That's probably the oldest of all of the different companies. Out of all of the companies that are around putting out exploitation movies, they've been around for about 10 or 11 years, I think, maybe a little bit more. And then you have Blue Underground, which is one of my favorites. That was a company that was started by Bill Luswig, who was doesn't really direct films anymore, but he is one of my favorite exploitation directors. He I always talk about it, but my favorite genre in the exploitation world is the slasher world, and Bill Luswig directed Maniac, which is my all-time favorite slasher movie. He's done a lot of great movies. Probably his most popular movies are the Maniac Cop series, which are just awesome. I did a review on the first Maniac Cop, but I love Bill Luswig to death. He's my favorite slasher director, and also uh, Maniac is easily my favorite of that whole genre. He kind of retired about 10 years ago or so from making films, and then he started Blue Underground, and that whole change, or like kind of where he moved his career into becoming like a production guy, and he started his own company. He basically set out to release all of these great exploitation movies that were like huge influences on him, and he really specialized. Blue Underground really specializes in all of the great Italian exploitation movies, a lot of Lucio Fulci movies. I mean, you name it, all kinds of American exploitation directors, but just a fabulous label. And I kind of feel like when he moved into doing, you know, when he made that transition from director to starting his own company, releasing movies, I almost kind of feel like it's kind of this thing of where he was like paying it forward, where he wanted to like pay tribute to all of the films and filmmakers that were, real integral to him growing up, and really a lot of movies that and putting a light on all the movies and the directors that really helped shape him as a as a great director. He grew up, he's a New Yorker, and he like there's all these great interviews I've seen with him where he was in New York, and it's like kind of in its renaissance period as far as exploitation. He lived in New York, went to lived in on 42nd Street in New York during the 70s and 80s when grindhouse cinemas were everywhere. So he was like such a part of that entire scene. And so now, like with his label Blue Underground, they showcase all of those films that at one point were shown in New York at that time, and all the drive-ins around the country, and all the other grindhouse theaters that were going on. So very cool, and I feel like there's so many interesting periods in film history, but I really love, and I'm just completely fascinated with that period of New York. I would have loved to have, you know, been old enough to have seen seen movies in that format, even though New York at that time had a really dangerous reputation. It would have been just amazing to have been, living in that kind of, environment, or just being able to have access to, all of these films and getting to see them on the big screen. A really special time, I think, in film history. But the treatment that these movies now get through all of these companies is, easily head and shoulders above the quality of the films back then, or at least the from a technical side. So just tremendous, and Vinegar Syndrome is no exception. They're really huge. My favorite label is probably Severin, and then also Mondo Macabra. Severin is the company that really I feel really delivers the goods. They give you truly your bang for your buck with the releases that they put out. It's just tremendous. And Mono Macabre is just amazing. But Vinegar Syndrome is fantastic. And getting back to Master of the World, like in the beginning of the show, I was saying how this is like basically the exploitation version of Quest for Fire. You have they're all Italian actors and it was an Italian production. The funny thing is, I started watching this again last night, and it had been a few months since I've seen this. I love this movie. This movie is like brutal as all hell. Like, and it's so gritty. It's got this really psychedelic element to it. Um, but the budget is really low in comparison, say, to Quest for Fire, which was a pretty big budget, more or less a Hollywood version of this. But Quest for Fire is an awesome movie. I do love it. And there's all Italian. The whole cast is Italian. And the funny thing is, I started watching this, and I forgot that this was like an Italian production. So I was looking for, on the special features, with a lot of these foreign films, you have the choice of watching it in its native speaking language, or watching the dubbed version, the American dubbed version. And usually, like I've talked about it before, if I have that option to watch, like I have a lot of the exploitation movies I own now and that I've been watching are foreign films. And I notice I love watching the cheesy dubbed English versions, because they just add an extra level of where it's even more ridiculous and absurd, and it's hilarious. But I notice if particularly if that movie has got a pretty good plot line, or it's got a pretty interesting story, and it's like pretty cohesive. A lot of the times for exploitation movies, you know, things can go off the tracks pretty quickly, where there will be some kind of setup in a certain particular film, and then suddenly you're thrust into this other world, and the editing is like you're suddenly like, wait, what happened? Now we're in this thing, or where are we? And suddenly there's like this thing of where you get disoriented, and it doesn't really make sense, but then it kind of does. and that's due to, maybe some of the bad editing that happens. But a lot of the times I find it almost adds to the charm. But in regards to a lot of the foreign films, I notice if I have the option to watch a film in its native, like say an Italian film, if I get the option to watch it in its native tongue and watch it in its original language in Italian, but with English subtitles, versus the dubbed American version, the Italian version is way more cohesive, uh, and the story is a lot more is a lot easier to follow, and the characterizations are usually better. Just the general storyline is better, and the translation is there. I noticed too with watching and this goes, I think, for really all foreign films that I see and that I own. When you watch the original language version versus the dubbed version, the translation 90% of the time is way off when you watch the dubbed version. So that you lose a lot of kind of what the story is about. So when I watched this again, I started watching this again last night. I was like, oh wait, I forgot that this is an Italian movie. So I looked on the menu to see if it has the Italian version, and it doesn't. And I realized the reason is, which I thought was hilarious, is because there's virtually no dialogue in this movie. So there's basically it's basically just all of these prehistoric cavemen, Cro-Magnon men, just kind of grunting with clubs and spears, and there's no real dialogue. So it's pretty funny. It was like, oh no, you don't really need subtitles, or you need it doesn't really matter what version you're trying to look for, and plus there just wasn't that option. But I will have to say that this movie, I do uh, prefer this movie to Quest for Fire, because it's definitely, it's way more psychedelic. It's got this very um, trippy psychedelic acid infused aesthetic behind it. It has the brutality in this movie. There are certain scenes in this film that are just so brutal. I mean, there's cannibalism. There's Within the first 10 minutes, there's a scene of where these two tribes are fighting, and it's centered on this basically this tribe that is like a cult, or like kind of a religious cult, and they look at the bear as being this god. They worship the bears. They have this like figurehead, and they use this. There's scenes of where they have this like altar, and they have this giant grizzly bear head and they use this as like their altar, and it's a god that they worship, and they worship nature, but it's in it's encapsulated in the in, you know in the figure of the bear, the animal, and so everything is kind of the way they live is in accordance to their will, to the bear's will. And there's a whole, so it's centered on this cult that worships the bear, and there's a scene like about 10 or 15 minutes into the movie where you see them come across this other tribe, and there's this big like war and fight that breaks out, and the cult tribe, the cult of the bear tribe, cuts off all of the heads of the men of the other party that they're fighting, and they just totally annihilate them and crush them. They seem like they're a little bit more uh, prolific at fighting. They have better weapons. They're a little bit more advanced, and they just crush this other tribe, and they cut off all of their heads. And there's a scene of where at the end of the war they go back, or at the end of the fight they go back to their caves, and they have this fire, and they're sitting at this fire, all of the men with the severed heads, the heads that they decapitated, and they start eating the heads, and they're like eating the brains, and it's like totally gnarly and nasty. Way more graphic than Quest for Fire, even though Quest for Fire is a brutal movie, but and there's like there are like pretty brutal rape scenes in that movie, but this movie, like I said, is like the exploitation version of that. And I like I had said before, the exploitation world is an interesting thing because on one hand, people, you know, don't take it, or a fraction, I would say a fraction of the movie going audience, or people who know about film, or people who are fans of film, there's like a fraction of where people don't really take any aspect or take exploitation movies seriously. They look at them as just being, kind of trashy garbage. And I do too. I have that view of them too, but I also look at them as just being incredibly entertaining and just wild and you know and so outside of the traditional Hollywood system. Kind of like in this weird way, almost like outsider art, and I know that term is very subjective, but I kind of look at it as that, it's just, to me, it's got this like punk rock aesthetic, totally working outside of any kind of established like system, and where these guys were like guerrilla filmmakers and just doing all of this stuff and being really prolific, but just putting out all this content and not like sticking to any kind of rules that, quote unquote rules of what Hollywood's, would lay down as far as, well, in order to make a movie, you need to have this kind of budget. And if you're going to get your movie done, you need to have this kind of distribution. You need to have, uh, a script, or your cinematography or your editor kind of follow these guidelines of rules. And if you're going to have, locations, this is the guidelines that you need to follow. So Hollywood is like always kind of set out, always has this kind of a rule book, or a playbook that they use, where it's like an established way of how they make films, to a degree, like a formulaic way. And I feel like with the whole exploitation world, it basically takes all of that and just like throws it out, and there are no rules. I think a lot of these directors kind of created their own rules, created their own reality. Jess Franco, famous Spanish director, really, as a director, really highly prolific as a director, but just really messed with, quote unquote, like traditional narratives as to what you would, if you watched, say an American detective story, or like say an American, something more in the Hollywood vein, there would be like a traditional narrative that would follow, or it would be, there would be certain tropes that would always be introduced, or like say if it's a murder suspense movie, or an action movie, or a horror film, there's a formula to that. There's a set way of doing that, and the audience is going to a lot of those films, with the expectation that things are, kind of gonna they're kind of gonna be set in this, to a degree, of formulaic time frame, and a little bit of a level of predictability. There's going to be rules on how, of how things will play out. And I feel like somebody like Jess Franco took all of that stuff and just threw it out. Where he, I felt, I feel like now, and he's emerged as one of my favorite directors, where he just totally was a maverick, but took all those rules and threw them out and just messed with people's expectations, and didn't have any of those quote unquote Hollywood traditions in his films. Just really kind of as a viewer and as a fan, like I feel like when I watch his films, he really like messes with my expectations, and it always like his films always go in directions that I never expected, you know, and that can be in many different genres, whether it's a giallo film or a suspense film or a horror film. He always kind of messed with like convention and took things in all these different directions, and also a lot of his films were much more low budget. So that's one of the things I love about it. And other directors like Herschel Gordon Lewis, same thing, like a total like kind of punk rock maverick as far as how he would do these films, and totally like against any kind of status quo. Lucio Fulci, all of the great Italian directors, really worked outside of any kind of conventional way of filmmaking. And it's all subjective, like to, if you're going to consider, you know, uh, Herschel Gordon Lewis as like a great director, that's kind of questionable. I think he was a great director and he's one of my favorites, but he was kind of a carny guy. He was kind of like uh, a showman too. So there's like that aspect too. And all of these filmmakers were really passionate with what they did, and there is a level of silliness and where it's totally absurd and ridiculous, and but I kind of feel like it makes their work to a degree even more enjoyable to a degree. I like, and I've talked about how well, like especially around Master of the World, which is essentially I feel like is a knockoff and a total exploitation movie off of Quest for Fire. I've used examples of that before, where like Steven Spielberg when he put out Jaws, which was a one of the greatest horror movies ever, one of the greatest movies, if not the greatest movie that Steven Spielberg has done ever in his career, and I love that movie to death. But you in the exploitation world, you had these other weird knockoffs that came out of that, like Maniac, for instance. Maniac was very much influenced by Jaws, especially the first half, and it was like kind of a ripoff of that, at least in the beginning of that movie. And Bill Luswig talks about that a lot. Joe Spinell, who plays Maniac, and then also The Car with James Brolin. Jaws on land, and so like these exploitation versions are like movies that are ripping off that, but they don't have the highbrow quality, and they have this real super duper campiness around in there, and they have this pulpy aspect to them that gives them this totally kind of gritty, aesthetic, or creates this gritty aesthetic around the film. And it's just, I don't know, there's something about it that's just so cool. And I feel like Master of the World does exactly that. And it's totally like an exploitative version of Quest for Fire, but I really think because of the exploitation nature of it, it's really a it's its own thing. It's the same kind of movie. The story is the same, but it has a totally different vibe. And the violence in this movie is like really brutal, and it's got this really psychedelic element that is very different from Quest for Fire. This was a movie I bought about a year or two ago, and I had never totally bought this on a whim. Never heard of it. It just looked amazing, and again, the artwork is just insane. It's just amazing. This packaging is just so awesome. I mean, look at this artwork. I mean, just so awesome. There's a lot of great interviews on here, packed with all kinds of cool special features. Just awesome. The transfer of this film from the original negative to the digital format is tremendous. And it's funny because this just came out literally, it had just come out 2 years after Quest for Fire. So, yeah, pretty wild. And Alberto Cavallone was the director of this. Um, and he was a pretty famous Italian exploitation director. He did films like The Babysitter, Africa 1973, Maldoro. Uh, he also did Zelda in 74, Master of the World. Um, Blue Movie in 1978. Blowjob was another movie he's done. I haven't seen any of his other films. I haven't come across, since I bought this movie, I haven't come across any of his other films yet, but I definitely want to see it. Spell Dolce Matteo, which looks totally crazy. It's a 77 film. Um, yeah, just wild. And, he was exclusively an Italian director who, like, specialized in, all of these crazy kind of exploitation movies. Pretty interesting. Alberto Cavallone was an Italian film director and screenwriter. He was born in Milan, Italy. Uh, Cal- Cavallone's films are usually looked at as anti conventional and often contain a mixture of graphic violence, surrealism, and eroticism. And that pretty much sums up this film. I mean, it's got this real psychedelic quality. It's it's so raw, it's so dirty and nasty, and you get this like sense of, you know, what it might have been like to be a primitive man during this time and trying to survive. It's just an awesome movie. Um, and again, it's got some sequences of violence in this film that are just like shocking as all hell. But it's awesome. I mean, it definitely, with the violence in the film, it goes to places where you're like, wow, they were full in. They were not messing around. And yeah, it's so awesome. I love this movie. Definitely a movie I haven't heard anybody talk about this film, and I love this movie to death. I don't have any other Alberto Cavallone films, but I uh, I keep my eyes peeled, and I will keep my eyes peeled to see if I come across any of his other films, and I'm sure they're all out there. But this is an awesome movie. This is a beautifully this film is so beautifully transferred to Blu-ray. Uh, Super cool. And I believe the history of this film, it had a little bit of success when it came out. Really obscure movie though, I think for the most part. But it was like in the underground circuit when it came out. I know it did have a good period of like a theatrical run. It was in the theaters for a while, and then it went into total obscurity, I think. But it definitely had a little bit of a niche or an audience that it had connected with. People who are, I've heard, in, well, mostly on this package where on the special features, there are a few people in the film industry that regard this film as being a real sensation, or at least when upon its initial release, it was a sensation, and it was a very controversial film because of the violence and the graphic nature of it. Um, and it's funny because horror films now, and I consider this to be, I mean, it's an exploitation movie, but I definitely consider this to be, I could, even though it's a different thing, it's about, prehistoric man. But I could see this being categorized as a horror film because of the violence and stuff in it. I mean, when I did buy this film, it was in the horror section. But I wonder, like a film like this, if this was to come out now, would it be even made? It's because of like the nature of some of the violence in this film, where it's just like, holy shit, it's like shocking, but real. It feels real. Like this is probably what really happened. Um, and I often wonder, like, wow, like would this come out today? And I don't know if it would. I don't know. Like, and it's an interesting time because we live in a day of lots of remakes, and a lot of people kind of crap on movies where they consider them to be, say, like torture porn, like movies. I know a lot of people that don't like the Purge movies or Human Centipede movies or uh, the Hostel movies, or like movies like Cabin Fever. But particularly around Hostel and that franchise, written and directed by Eli Roth, and then also the the uh, the Saw franchise, and definitely the Human Centipede, uh, which is a pretty amazing franchise. I really love the first one, and I just got that recently on Blu-ray, and I'll be doing a show on that one. But a lot of those films get this label where they're called torture porn, and I know like people have this thing of where they don't watch films that are kind of considered that because of the graphic nature and the violence around them. And I get it, but it has this like kind of dark cloud around it and a stigma around it. And those are all like new movies. So like you have movies that do go into areas that are very uh, focused on graphic violence. But I also feel like those movies are really good. Like they're actually really good quality movies, especially like the Purge movies and some of the Saw movies I like quite a bit. But they're pretty brutal and graphic. So like you have, on one hand, you have movies, Hollywood horror films that get this reputation where they're really graphic and brutal and all this kind of stuff. But then on the other side of things, there's all kinds of remakes of films of where I feel like in some ways there's real sanitized versions of them. Like for instance, films like RoboCop. There was a remake of that came out really recently, which I feel was a really terrible version of such a classic. The original RoboCop is brutal as all hell, and it's like totally messed up, and I love that movie to death. And the newer version that came out is like really sanitized. It's actually rated PG-13. Um, so you have that, and then like other films like Total Recall that have this real sanitized version of the original, which the original is really amazing and pretty brutal at the same time. And there's a bunch of other things like that where like these Hollywood sanitized versions of the films that do come out. Uh, even another one that I thought was really a big disappointment was The Last House on the Left, the remake of that one. Incredibly sanitized in comparison to the original. So you have that too, and I always find that, like, I don't know if a film like that goes to places like this would be really allowed to be made. I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's like you have the torture porn thing, and all the films that have jump scares, or whatever. But it's interesting. But I highly recommend this movie. 1983, Master of the World. This is definitely one of the best Italian exploitation movies. I prefer it as great as Quest for Fire is, and I think it's an awesome movie. I prefer this version of it. It's basically the same story, but just way more nasty, down and way more down and dirty. Um, yeah, just awesome. So this is Jason Dean, and thanks again for supporting this channel. If you like it, if you like this channel, please subscribe and check out my page. And thanks again for all your support. And stay warm out there. And we will see you next time. Peace.